fantastical, so unpredictable, here on the SNL Network.
Yes, that is right. Welcome, everybody, on in to the Saturday Night Network for the final Monday in April. And we are here for a very special podcast. And usually special means good, might mean bad in this case, because there is a potential writer strike on the horizon for Saturday Night Live. When we started this season, season 48, there was no real talk about it yet. Maybe some of the studio execs knew about this, but we as the fans didn't have any idea. And then slowly the news trickled out throughout the season that this could be happening. As it stands right now, still up in the air what's going to be happening with the rest of season 48. But we really felt like on the podcast, it was the right time to explain to all of the listeners the history of SNL and writers' strikes, because this is not the first time this has happened during an SNL season. So in order to do that, I figured I got to bring in one of the greatest historians of Saturday Night Live, and that is my friend Bill Kenney. So Bill, how are you doing?
John, I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. It's rare on the podcast that I get to show my extensive useless knowledge outside of SNL. So I'm excited to get into it, even though the circumstances are not the greatest as far as the strike goes. So
Definitely. Bill, is this the first time that you and I are podcasting, just the two of us?
I believe it is. Yeah.
How fun is that? Okay, cool. Yeah,
This is great. I feel like Mikey Day, except without the talent and the money. So this is great.
You're plenty talented. Mikey would agree. But yeah, our podcasting career, Bill, goes back a very long time, all the way back to October or November of 2020. So great to be with you tonight. And thanks for everybody for joining us in the chat. This is definitely going to be an interactive show. So if you have ideas or things you want to talk about when it comes to the potential strike, let us know. We'll talk about it on the show as well. But yeah, let's dive in and talk about where we're at in the SNL season. So we're 18 episodes in. Typically, this is the time where we're looking forward to the end of the season, something that is really exciting, bringing in, huge names for hosts. And yeah, whether you love it or not, Pete Davidson is a huge name that could be coming in at the beginning of May. We look forward to a season finale and all of that stuff. So May for me is one of my favorite SNL months, obviously. And, the fact that that could be impacted really sucks. So Bill, how are you feeling right now before we, start to describe what it is that is going on?
I feel anxious. I always, when these strikes occur, and the last two have particularly been something that stressed me out. But SNL is the thing that always affects me the most because, as you know, things that are scripted and filmed, movies, TV shows, they're 3-4 weeks in the can. And in the case of movies, sometimes a year or two in advance. So you're not feeling that effect. With SNL being so immediate, if they go on strike next Monday, that's it. Show's not starting on Tuesday. They're not starting to write on Tuesday. So that's very anxiety ridden. So as much as I'm not necessarily looking forward to Pete, I would take a garbage can with a hat on hosting SNL just to have a show because as you said, May is such a huge month for SNL between the Mother's Day episode and then the finale that usually comes the week after. So feeling a lot of trepidation.
Yeah, I love this comment from Manette in the chat who says, this is the embodiment of the "this is fine" while the room is burning around us. And that is how I feel because I love season 48 of Saturday Night Live. Like maybe it isn't for everybody, but in modern times, this is a really good season of the show, one of the best we've had in years, and there's so much to look forward to. And I would hate to, stop the momentum of having some really strong shows in 2023. A lot of people seem to be loving the show even more in this calendar year. So for me, at least, I hate to think that was it with the Ana de Armas episode, and I'm hoping we can at least maybe get one episode in. Who knows how long the strike would last and what the details are of all of that. But I'm, and anxiously anticipating what's going to find out. And of course, for us over here at the podcast, there's a lot of programming that happens, booking the shows and having the hot take show. There's not going to be a hot take show, right? So, those are things that are so minor in the grand scheme of things, but it's things that we have to think about. So why don't we dive in and talk about what is the Writers Guild of America? What are the strikes and why is this happening? So that if you're not aware, maybe you're not as in tune with all the TV lingo and language, we can bring you up to speed on all of that. And then we'll go through some of the history of this affecting the show because it's happened throughout every era of SNL for the most part. So I'm going to start with explaining what is the WGA. You might have seen that all over the place, right? Well, the WGA is the Writers Guild of America. It's a writers union. So the same way that you may work for, department stores and there might be a union there and people get together and they unionize to get fair wages or certain rights that they might not otherwise have if they didn't unionize. In general, writers who work in Hollywood are in the Writers Guild of America. And they have contracts with the Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, the AMPTP. And the AMPTP negotiates on behalf of some of the largest studios in Hollywood. So when you think about that, it's the Writers Union, the WGA. Then we have our Alliance of Motion Picture and Television Producers, which represent some of the studios. Now, just like in any industry, the people at the top have the most money. And Hollywood has the most money of them all, right? They're some of the biggest money makers in the world. So the thing is how does the money trickle down to the people that help produce the work? And on a smaller scale with SNL this season, we saw that, right? I mean, Bill, we recently had a strike specific potentially to SNL, which was the post-production strike, where we had people who were working on the film unit. So that's not so dissimilar from what we're seeing on a grander scale with writers across America.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point because we've seen this, and it's very easy, and this happens in sports a lot too, to look at a strike and go, well, is 10 million that much worse than getting 8 million and things like that. And it happens with baseball, like they're millionaires already, but with writers in particular. And if you go on Twitter, follow some of the people, some of the writers who have been on sitcoms and things like that, they may make some money for about 6 months. They may be asked to be on a show for a year or two, and then they may go years without a job. And so they don't have a lot of security in their jobs, even for long-running shows. And SNL is a great example of that. The writers turn over quite a bit. So even in the microcosm of SNL or network television, it's a very important thing. And these strikes often follow the technology, as we'll start to get into when we get into some of the older ones. In 1981, it was about pay TV, which obviously is now cable, and VHS sales and things like that. Those were starting out. And then when we got to 2007, it was about DVD sales. And now we're at the streaming point. Now, streaming's been around for a while, but the contracts were written long before a lot of the streamers blew up and started taking so much away from networks. So it's an important point. As disappointed and sad as we may be, it's still something that they have to fight for.
Definitely. And the major difference, as most people would know now, is when you're watching a streaming television show, it's rarely ever 20 to 24 episodes like we used to get on, regular television where, you'd watch a show and you get that whole full season. Now, most seasons are 12 episodes. So there's even less work out there for some of these people. And it just, the whole world has changed in the way that we view TV and movies now. So it's, the contracts no doubt had to be rewritten, but the question is will they get their fair due here, the writers? And so far the answer is no. So far they've been negotiating and they have not gotten what they've been asking for. And from what I've been told from some industry people, it seems like they're a little, they're pretty far away from each other at this point. So the latest that was publicized was that the Writers Guild of America had to vote on authorizing a strike. So that doesn't mean that they will strike, but that they have the ability to strike. So 97.85% of the Writers Guild of America has voted to authorize a strike. Something very similar happened in 2017, only 5 or 6 years ago, where they authorized a strike. Ultimately, they negotiated and nothing ended up happening as far as the strike was concerned. So it doesn't necessarily mean that one equals the other, but that we're headed towards a potential strike. That is definitely something that is on the horizon and something that is very close because the contracts expire May 1st, which is 1 week from today, meaning that 1 week from today, Monday, would be the last day of those contracts. So writers, I believe, if I understand correctly, can work next Monday, but wouldn't necessarily be able to work Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. And That is a problem because SNL relies on writers to write all the way up until 11:29, and it is pretty impossible to put on a show without the writers. So, Bill, anything on that?
Yeah, that's an important point. And let's say we get to, I mean, this is all semantics and guessing at this point, but let's say Friday, Saturday, they're making progress, but they don't have a deal. So May 1st is that kind of first thing that we're looking at. It could be, hey, we're getting close. We're not there yet. Let's push it back to May 5th. Let's push it back to May 8th. And at that point, things will continue as we expect, and that'll be a great sign too, because if they've actually made the progress enough to say we're not going to do it on May 1st, then that's a good sign for the overall strike itself. So, fingers crossed. I mean, it'll be an interesting scenario if they let it go till, let's say they say May 5th, and that's Friday. So they start writing the Pete Davidson episode. What happens then? Do they just get some stuff in the can? Do it do a lot of pre-tapes? Do we have like a Paul Rudd Christmas episode ready to roll with a lot of stuff that's already made, so there won't be any writing after X date? So it's an interesting scenario.
Yeah, my guess is we're not gonna. It's completely conjecture, but my guess is that we're not going to have that situation. I think if it's going to be delayed, you would delay it like a week at a time. That's what like the history of this has been. So I think, excuse me, I think that there's no chance it would be like a May 5th thing. I think it would be more like a May 1st thing, if anything, or May 8th or May 15th, that type of thing. So all those things are definitely still on the table. But what I would love to talk about, is basically what is going to happen once a strike occurs, which is it's not like, the world will stop existing, but I think that TV shows and movies will be affected in a certain sequence. So first up is the late night shows. So that not only includes SNL, but it would include like Colbert and Fallon and Kimmel and all of them, because they rely on their writers to write most of the material the day of their shows. So that would be it. Now, as far as I understand, and I think I saw this in the chat somewhere as well, there's still planned shows for Seth, for Jimmy, for all of them for next week and the week after. So everyone's like business as usual until those shows get canceled. So I would think that, they would be the first to stop. And that's what happened in 2007, 2008. The one exception was something really interesting happened in 2007, 2008, which was that David Letterman at the time, he had owned his own production company and writers were signed to contracts with him directly, which allowed them to come back to work. So you actually had some late night writers come back earlier than others. So it is definitely possible that certain segments of Hollywood can negotiate their own contracts. SNL has never done this, but you never know. Maybe if it's so close to the season, they wouldn't. But perhaps if the strike continued for months and it went into September or October, then you would look at potentially having some type of contract that would be negotiated that would allow SNL writers to work specifically. So right now, I'm not as concerned about season 49, more just, concentrated on May.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, I mean, that's a whole podcast in itself, the late night shows, because there's a lot of interesting history with that. The Letterman thing was interesting because he owned the company and CBS didn't own any part of either Late Show or Late Show. So, but that was 2 months into the strike. And a lot of these guys were paying staff out of their pockets. Kimmel very famously was paying his staff out of his pocket as well. But if you go back to 1988, now this is an entirely different time. Of course, you're talking about 3 networks, very little cable. Johnny Carson came back. That strike lasted for 6 months. He came back after 2 months and was allowed to write because he was not part of the WGA for some reason. Now, today, as far as I understand, all of the late night hosts are. I think in 08, I think the only one that wasn't was Carson Daly. But he came back and he wrote his own monologue. He wrote skits, the only time we're allowed to say skits on Saturday Night Network. And so he came back without his writers. And so that's a very interesting thing that I don't think would happen today. But yeah, I mean, if these shows are daily overall, so how do you can't go 6, 7, 8 months with staffs of hundreds and leave these people out in the cold. So I think that's why they get a little bit more leeway And in the '08 one as well, all of the other ones came back without writers. I remember Conan coming back, I think that same week as Letterman, without writers, and talked about his beard for about 20 minutes. So they can ad lib. They cannot have anything written on the paper. There cannot be anything, pen to paper or on a teleprompter. It has to be completely ad lib. So that's why a lot of them don't do that.
And you said something really interesting here, which is that, there is a ton of crew as well that are impacted by this, because you have to think about all of the people like makeup artists or hairstylists, just at a simple level, in terms of SNL, people who work in the cue card department, like any department here is also impacted, right? Because no show means no work. So it really affects all of Hollywood, which is why you often see either other people who work in other aspects of Hollywood end up picketing with the writers, or the actors end up being somewhat involved in helping negotiations, because it's to everyone's benefit to get a fair shake for the writers. So really, it's going to be the late night shows that we're going to start with, SNL as well, and that will be primarily what affects us over here. And then it'll become like I think daytime soap operas would probably be next, and then if this goes on for a longer time, scripts for broadcast television shows would not be written, which would probably delay shows starting up in the fall, especially for traditional television that runs their like October or September to May schedule. So that would probably be impacted. And I guess they're used to contingencies and all of that, since recently with COVID, a lot of stuff was impacted as well. And then, the actors themselves, they're unionized in the Screen Actors Guild, so they're actually completely separate. So if projects are already completed with scripts, they're able to film their projects. So for example, if there's like a Marvel movie that's completely written already, they're able to then go out and film those projects during the writer's strike, because they wouldn't necessarily require the writers to come in on that. So it's an interesting loophole for some projects that may be completed or not. And what you will see is a lot more reality shows coming on the air. I mean, that was big in 2007, 2008. So we'll talk about that when we get to that. But I think that should give you a good example, if you're a listener, to try and understand what's happening here, a good grasp of what is happening overall. So Bill, any other, overall notes on the strike potentially?
Yeah, and that's on a case-by-case basis as well. Steve Carell famously would not cross the line, even though he wasn't part of the WGA. So even though The Office at the time, which was red hot, had a couple scripts in the can, as they say, that he wouldn't cross the picket line. So they weren't able to continue. He had enough power that he could do that. Would that happen today? Would that happen on a regular show? Probably not, but it's something to consider.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's take you all the way back to season 6 of Saturday Night Live. So just to picture in your mind where we're at in SNL history, first 5 years, they're pretty much their own show, with Lorne Michaels and Dick Ebersol and all of the greats, producers and creators of Saturday Night Live, putting together the initial incarnation of the show. All of the original cast is there. Some amazing writers. You've heard all the stories about the greats. But what happens in 1980, most of that changes. Almost everybody leaves the show. The remaining cast members, Lorne leaves the show, Dick leaves the show, and in comes Gene Dumanian, who worked on the show previously, to be the sacrificial lamb and run the next iteration of SNL. And that is the 1980-81 season 6 of the show. And we get a really fun cast that I think is so underrated at the time. And, most notably known for Joe Piscopo and Eddie Murphy, but also had greats with, Gail Matthias, Danny Dillon, and Risley, Gilbert Gottfried, of course, a lot of people know nowadays, Charlie Rocket as well. Am I missing anybody?
Not out of the main cast. No, you got it.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I got all of them all. All right. And then some great feature players as well. And what we have is 12 episodes of them just trying to figure it out. And it is a lot of mess. It's a lot of fun. I actually think there's some really fun sketches in there throughout that season. But we go 12 episodes. Episode number 12 is Bill Murray comes back to host the show. And it's really about galvanizing the cast. You can do this, but it's not going to work. The network's over it. People are not watching the show the same way. Gene Domanian gets canned. In comes Dick Ebersol to run the show again. We get a 13th not hosted episode of the show, which is sort of like a Chevy Chase hosted episode in a way, technicality. But he's there. We get some throwback sketches. Al Franken's there, and it really feels like the show is returning to its roots. And we see some of the season 7 cast come in. And what's interesting at the time is it's still time to have many more episodes in season 6 for the show to figure out what is going to happen. And we end up getting a 3-month strike instead in season 6. So we have that one episode of Dick Ebersol and then 5 months off for him to figure out what to do for season 7. And that is the first instance in the history of the show that the writer's strike has changed the course of SNL history. So, Bill, I have thought for so many years about what season 6 would have looked like if there was no writer's strike. Have you had those same thoughts?
Oh, I think this is the SNL community, the nerds of our community, as it were. I think this is our Rosetta Stone, trying to figure out what would have happened. So many questions. They had announced so many hosts that we'll get into. But the strike actually started the morning of April 11th, where they ran the Chevy Chase episode. So they couldn't write Weekend Update jokes because of how close it was and the rewriting that they do with that. So a lot of those jokes on Weekend Update were old jokes that Michael O'Donoghue had written. There's no topicality at all. I don't think that would happen in this day and age. I don't think that you would have it that close where the writer's strike happens Saturday morning and you go on the air Saturday night. But yeah, I mean, there's so many weird things about this time. You've got Gail Mathias and Denny Dillon, who weren't fired, who were, still part of the show with Tony Rosato, Tim Kazurinsky, and Emily Prager, of course, and Laurie Metcalf, the two shortest tenured SNL cast members of all time. Emily not even appearing in the show, just in the credits. And I mean, Franken and Davis were supposed to host the following week with the Grateful Dead. But there was also Steve Martin, Buck Henry. Buck Henry was going to come and host on season 6. Now, imagine the trajectory of that if he had not been kind of pigeonholed into just being with the original cast. Would he have come back all the way through the 2000s? Would he have been another Steve Martin? Would it have been Steve versus Buck? That's an interesting aspect of it to me, that, what could have been.
Well, I just want to say, because I do know, so confirmed, the shows that we know for sure are Tom Davis and Al Franken, which would have been the first time, I guess, in the history of SNL that we have former writers coming back to host the show. Later, we'll have Larry David and Conan and Mulaney, but, that would have been the first instance of that. Also, I know that Al Franken was in talks to eventually run the show, so that would have been an interesting thing about, what happens there. And then, so you said Davis and Al Franken, Grateful Dead, that's the April 18th show, so that would have been the following week, and that's the for sure one. Now, the one that's been long speculated for the April 25th show is Dan Aykroyd as the host for that one. So that's interesting to think about, because obviously Dan Aykroyd doesn't come back and host the show till 2003. And and it's a big surprise, I think, when he shows up in the late 80s and then he ends up being, co-hosting sort of with Goodman for a long time. But, that is a very big deal, because I would have to imagine that during either the Davis and Franken or the Aykroyd episode, maybe even the Buck episode, the original cast probably would show up a bunch of times. I would assume Belushi would get in there at some point. So I could only imagine the big moments we could have gotten in that season.
Yeah, I mean, the episode 13 kind of laid the groundwork for that, for Chevy and Franken and Davis to come back. They opened the show with all of the old props and Mr. Bill and the cold open. So Chevy kind of opened that door, and that I think the others would have walked through. Maybe not everybody, but we certainly could have been talking about Belushi, maybe a Blues Brothers redo. There could have been a million different things. The Denny and the Gail thing always bothers me, because I feel like they were so talented and on a cast that was unfairly derailed and derided. So it would have been interesting to see what they could have done with the other cast members, seeing them work with season 7 people who came in. So that always bugs me as well.
For sure. And I definitely see people in chat talking about Al Franken as the potential to run the show. And I know that was, talked about during the end of season 5, potentially the limo for a lamo thing ended that. But I had heard that there were still some talks and rumors while people were deciding about what to do. And obviously, I mean, if he was allowed back on the show, it wasn't completely over there. So something interesting to think about. And then the Buck Henry one, I mean, Buck Henry means a lot to me as an SNL host. So that would have been fantastic just to see what would happen there. And I have to think about, the women of SNL that sort of really never ended up coming back to the show. And we'll put a pin in that because there is a hosted episode that was canceled from one of the women, the original OG women of SNL. But I have to think about their involvement in season 6 as well. So it is just really like a glass doors moment. And then you brought up Danny Dillon and Gail Matthias, who were kept on at the end of season 6. And we interviewed Denny Dillon on the podcast a little while ago. I actually got to meet her and see her in New York City a couple of weeks ago. So we had lunch, and she is just the most delightful, wonderful person you would ever meet. Could not be a kinder person. And I just really wanted to know, do you think you would have been let go if there was no writer's strike? I mean, and she says she thinks she probably still would have, and maybe that made her feel better about it after all these years, that it wasn't really that impactful. But I have to think, if Gail and Denny had been given the opportunity to go through the end of the season, I think they would be still on the show in season 7. So for me, I think they were probably, as you said, Bill, the most impacted by the potential of what happens in our universe versus another one.
Yeah, definitely. Gail, especially to me, I always loved her work, and she actually ended the Chevy show with the big fame number, and Chevy actually ended up picking her up, and she was singing the song throughout the studio. So, I mean, it was a nice way for her to go out. She couldn't have known that was going to be the last time she was on, so that's a little disappointing.
Yeah. Well, I love this stuff. I mean, this is the stuff I love talking about as an SNL fandom, just because what could have been. But anything else on season 6, or you're good there?
Well, the only other thing I want to bring up really quickly is that Franken and Davis, knowing that they were going to host the next week, actually mailed themselves sketches, postmarked that that they happened before the strike, that they were mailed before the strike. Today, you would just send an email to yourself and have the date on it, but Ebersol just decided he didn't want to do it. He didn't love a lot of the material that they had come up with, so he just canned the whole episode. So there's a way this could have happened, even with the strike already in motion, that we could have gotten the Frank and Davis episode we never got.
Do we know, as a fandom, anybody in the chat, let me know, do we know where those scripts are? Because I think that is some real SNL gold out there if anybody has a copy of those scripts.
Yes, mail them our way.
Yeah, please. Yeah. If anybody knows, let us know. We'll definitely, I would read them on the podcast if we got them. So that would be great. Okay. Well, basically, as we know through SNL history, so Ebersol takes over the show. We see some new cast members come in for season 7, some even more new ones come in from the Practical Theater Company in season 8. And then really we get to season 10, which is known as the year where we bring in some very famous people to be a part of the show, including Billy Crystal and Christopher Guest and Martin Short. Harry Shearer comes back to the show. It is a really fun and interesting show, but Ebersol is already thinking about potentially turning the show into a pre-filmed show and not making it live anymore. And is this going to be his last year? And ultimately it ends up being his last year on the show. And this is the only time in the history of the show where we actually get a writer's strike in the middle of the season. So a canceled episode, in the middle of the season, and we have a season before the writer's strike and after the writer's strike, if I understand correctly, Bill. Is that what you got too?
No, the 07-08 one was also middle of the season.
You were so right about that. Yes. Okay. Sorry. It was just so brief.
That was a big one.
All right. Take it from the top, people. All right. So this is why we do this live. All right. Well, this was one of the only times in the history of a show where the writer's strike happens in the middle of the season. So we get a really fun before and a really fun after. But in the middle, there's an important episode that is missing right in the middle of the season in March. So, Bill, why don't you tell the listeners what we would have gotten in 1985 had there been no writer's strike?
Well, as the promo that floated around when his son hosted a couple of years ago, we were supposed to get Eugene Levy and John Candy hosting, which also never happened. Very, very sad to not see this SCTV crossover. We already had Marty on the show. So it would have been great to see these guys play together on the SNL stage. Obviously, we lost John a couple years after that, so he never got the chance to come on and do this. It was heartwarming to see Eugene be able to come on and do a cameo during Dan's, even though it was during COVID. So yeah, that was a big loss. And this was kind of the way Ebersol. The strike only lasted 2 weeks, but Ebersol kind of took it, as you pointed out. This was kind of his way to be like, well, all right, I want to go all pre-tapes. He actually cut the season short himself. So they came back after the strike, and then they ended in April. They ended up not doing the last 3 episodes because he was just kind of over the whole thing. And that's kind of an interesting addendum to the history of SNL as well.
Yeah, and we have this SNL Film Festival, which is a special show that happens in the middle of season 10. And John Candy and Eugene Levy appear on that, promoting the show that would have been happening the following week. So that's the only, that is our real, like, okay, this was actually going to happen. So I think, that is something interesting. It's a very small strike, but it is a show that was canceled that was there. And that happens in 1985 during season 10. I'm trying to see if the chat has any other nuggets on this one, but I think
Casey points out that John did host in season 9. So yes, that's true, but would have been fun to see them together.
Yes. Yeah, 100%. That would have been great. And it would have been another fun show to have of all those season 10 cast that we, only got to see for a certain number of episodes. So I think the exciting part would have been getting to see like Martin Short with John Candy and Eugene Levy and that type of sketch that we could have potentially got. All right, but it's only a few years later, 1988, season 13, which is known as, a golden era, the second golden era of the show. This is a 22-week strike, which lasts 5.5 months. Very, very long time. I think it's, if I read correctly, it's the longest strike that the Writers Guild of America has ever had. And this happens right at Bill's, main entry into Saturday Night Live. He's absolutely loving the show. So I'm going to pass it over to you, Bill. Tell me your firsthand experience at the show getting cut during the wonderful season 13.
Oh, this was devastating as a young person who had only 3 channels and my 2 loves were SNL and Moonlighting. And I saw both of them suffer tremendously from this strike. Moonlighting ended up losing all its viewers basically because they were off the air for 6 months. And a lot of shows had this problem. But yeah, I mean, this was really, season 12 is when everybody came in, the people we all loved, that like Jan and Phil and Dana. But 13 is really where they found their footing. And it was such a shame for it to end in February. I mean, it was over so early. As a young person, I had no idea what was happening, why it was happening. And the fact that it never came back that season ended with Judge Reinhold, of all people. Just very, very devastating. It's hard to imagine in this era. It will be very sad next week if we don't have SNL. But there's so many other choices. There's so many other things to do. I'll go back and watch old SNLs if I have to. You didn't have that option back then. So it was really depressing. And of course, we know the host that we never got because of it, Gilda Radner, who was scheduled to host and sadly died less than a year later. And then it took SNL 17 years to get a female alumni host back on the show. So just a lot of bad things. This was probably the most devastating strike in the history of TV. And certainly SNL was one of the things, losing all the momentum of a great new cast.
Yeah, and I remember going through the seasons and feeling like, wow, the show is really hitting its stride. Like, this was the best SNL I've seen in a really long time. It could have been the greatest season in the history of the show. I ultimately think that season 14 is a candidate for that, being the greatest season in the history of SNL. And, the question is like, who would have hosted all of those remaining episodes? Really, we only know about Gilda and you two. And all I've ever heard about this is that a lot of the season 14 hosts in the fall would have potentially hosted in the spring. But I don't know if there's like some mystery nugget out there that somebody knows about a host that we never got from season 13. Obviously, Gilda is the major one here. That's the big storyline, which is just, it's what a tragedy that we, lost her and then also never got to see her come back to be on the show, because she was beloved by everybody that she met and that she worked with and that got to watch her on the show. And I just would have imagined getting to see like Rosanna Dana like in season 13 of Saturday Night Live, and getting to see Phil Hartman work with Gilda Radner. Like, just the possibilities. We always anticipate these anniversary shows or special shows when somebody's going to come back to see new cast members work with old ones. This was the best of all possibilities, and unfortunately we didn't get that. So as Bill said, totally devastating year that we lost having more episodes in 1988. And yeah, it's just it was a crazy time.
Now there is one positive nugget that comes out of this. Smiggle, my friend, and Odenkirk were looking for something to do with all this time off. So they went back to Chicago and did a show with Conan. I think it was called Happy Good Show. And this is where Schmeigel kind of works out the kinks and gets the Bears sketch rolling that he eventually brings back to SNL and became such a big part of the show in the early 90s. So there's always some light in the rain. So just wanted to point that part out.
Okay. And Bill, what were you watching during the 1988 writer's strike?
Oh my goodness, we didn't even own a VCR. I don't know. Probably read a book. I don't know.
Wow.
I know, right?
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of choices. Honestly, it's so hard to describe to people what it was like to just have the 3 channels. I mean, I feel like they probably just reran old SNLs every week, and I probably just watched those. I think that they were starting to put SNL into syndication at that point, so I might have been watching stuff on PBS and that kind of thing. So wasn't a lot to do, young man.
All right. Read a book. Wow. Okay. All right. Well, let's flash forward to a time that I was around for a writer strike. And this was 2007, 2008, another instance of a strike happening in the middle of a season where we got season 33 of the show. And this was a 14-week strike, began in November 2007, goes to February 2008. And yeah, I mean, 4 episodes into the season, the anticipation of a potential writer strike is brewing. Ultimately, we lose Maya Rudolph as a cast member during this strike, and we end up having Casey Wilson, who was hired when we returned from the show in February. I remember being so disappointed because personally, I know that season 32 is, probably, just the show is really getting its footing. It happens to be like a personal favorite of mine, just seeing like everybody trying to figure it out with after those big cuts. Like a lot of cast members got cut between season 31 and season 32. And then we just get like Andy Samberg and Bill Hader and Kristen Wiig and Jason Sudeikis starting to integrate with, Fred Armisen and Will Forte and all of them. And it's just becomes like really fun to see the show develop and the writing starting to really click. And then season 33 is really strong. Like it's a really strong start to the season, and the momentum of losing Maya Rudolph for me was like devastating because it was the first time in my SNL watching career that I lost a cast member that I really like grew up on watching. So that was a big shame. And yeah, I just remember the same thing, Bill. It was just so crazy. Just like everything, I'm so like TV oriented, and the fact that everything was stopping, and this was the boom of reality TV because every reality show basically, had seasons during this because it was the only thing that worked. I remember, like, I'm a Big Brother fan. That's one of the shows that I love as well. And Big Brother had a winter season, which was the first time they ever had that. And it was just weird, Bill. So what are your memories of the 2007, 2008 strike?
This was another one I was very devastated about. And this is pre-streaming for the most part. I mean, Netflix was starting to dip its toe into that. They were basically still DVDs, which RIP DVDs, Netflix. They just announced last week. I don't know who's still doing that other than your grandmother. Like, who's still getting DVDs in the mail from Netflix? But anyway, yeah, I mean, this was a high point, probably one of the last high points for network television in general, where you had the Thursday domination of 30 Rock, The Office. What else am I forgetting from that Thursday night?
Community and
no, Community hadn't started yet.
Okay. Parks and Rec. I'm trying to remember now.
No. Well, anyway, it
We'll
was
look
a
it
big
up.
night. Yes, we'll look it up. So seeing these shows, but that's the other advantage that the scripted shows have. The Office started putting a lot more episodes in the can. They had a lot of hour episodes that could be split up into 2 parts, and they were on the air until December. But yeah, it was really disappointing, especially we were
Did you
getting into
forget
the.
My Name is Earl,
Oh, My Name is Earl, of course.
followed by ER on
Yeah,
Thursdays
there you go.
and Scrubs?
Scrubs. That's the one I was trying to think of. Yes,
Yeah.
but yeah, I mean, it was really disappointing because with SNL in particular, we were getting into this huge political season, one of the most interesting political uh, times we've ever had. And in fact, the last episode we get with Brian Williams is the famous Obama cameo. And so at the time, it looked like Hillary was the front runner. Obama was just this cute outsider. And by the time they get back to the show in February, Obama's taken over. Lawrence pointed out that they weren't able to do a Mike Huckabee because of this. They had to kind of delay doing a Romney because of this. So there was a lot of disappointment on the show that they weren't able to get into the politics. But yeah, you're right. This was another great time of the show to see it just kind of come to a halt, especially so early. We never got a Christmas show, first time in the history of the show. And for Maya to just kind of go out the side door and not even get a goodbye was really sad.
That was definitely the toughest part for me with watching all of this. And then, let's talk about some of the canceled shows that would have happened then. So, Dwayne Johnson and Amy Winehouse was the show that was going to be happening next. And then Amy Winehouse obviously tragically passes, soon thereafter, and that never does appear on the show. Dwayne Johnson would have been returning for the first time since 2002 when he was known as The Rock and hosting. He will come back and host the following season. We then would have gotten Jonah Hill, and not The Rock, but Kid Rock would be his musical guest. That would have been the next one. I know how much you love Kid Rock, Bill. And Jonah Hill would end up hosting later in the season in March with Mariah Carey, who ended up replacing Janet Jackson, who was sick. So a lot of shuffling going on there. And like we said, Dwayne Johnson will host the season 34 with Ray LaMontagne. But yeah, it would, we don't know what other canceled episodes would have been planned for there, or if there were actually planned episodes that we lost throughout that strike. Here's something really interesting that happens though during that strike, which is Amy Poehler, who is the co-founder of the Upright Citizens Brigade, puts on an SNL episode called SNL on Strike at UCB. And we get the entire cast having an episode hosted by Michael Cera, musical guest Yola Tengo, I believe. Is that what it is? And it's the entire cast plus Rachel Dratch and Horatio come back. So season 31 cuts come on in, and we get everybody besides Maya puts on a show at UCB. And this is like the lost SNL episode, the one that's like totally not canon, but actually did happen. Bill, what did you know about this?
It was all over the internet that they were doing this, but I don't think I've ever seen 1 second of it. And I mean, I can't imagine.
I have, by the way.
You have?
Yes, I
Oh,
have. So this was on YouTube at the time. It got taken down pretty quickly, but I remember sitting on my computer watching this whole thing. And
wow.
I wouldn't have ever thought that 15 years later I'd be hosting an SNL podcast and would love to have had that footage. But watching it at the time, I was like, I needed my fix. So it is out there somewhere.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I've looked for it on occasion when we go down the rabbit holes on YouTube trying to find, but yeah, no luck. I would love to see what that looked like. I wonder if any of the sketches that they did eventually made their way onto SNL. So that's very interesting.
That I could not tell you, though. I do, if I remember, if there is anything that I do remember about that episode, is it was a lot of recurring characters, right? Because they were easier to write than having to, come up with new sketches. I love this thing from Casey in the chat who says Tom Hanks and Ben Affleck were supposed to host in December 2007. So interesting. Some Five Timers Club hosts there potentially coming back. But yeah, that has to, we have to find that. Somebody has that somewhere. I don't know if we need to call UCB and get the footage of that, but that would have been great. I mean, my only question is could that happen again, Bill? Would they ever do something like that again?
I think they would. I don't see a reason why they wouldn't. I don't think it would be taped because they would be worried about kind of breaking the picket line. But yeah, I think they could definitely find a way, especially if it went on too long, to exert that energy. So yeah, that would be great.
Here's another great thing here that Casey says that Jean K. Jean, that great Keenan character on Weekend Update, premiered at the strike show. So that's interesting as well. But yeah, I would love to obviously find that. I do wonder if they could actually pull off a strike show at, one of the comedy, clubs or anything like that now, because I think that there's so many other things for people to do, and like social media didn't exist in the same way that it does now, that like I feel like if SNL cast members are like not getting paid to do the show, you're not going to be able to wrangle them together to do something like this. And at the time the cast was so much smaller that they and so much closer, probably not to say that like they don't like each other now, but I'm just saying like it's such a tighter knit group then, that I think
Right.
it was like, let's all do this together. I don't feel like that could happen now.
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah. That you bring up a great point, because there are so many other things. But if they're still in New York waiting to see if the strike ends, I think that's the best possibility. And we got to get John back on a plane to New York, and we'll all meet up and go find this underground SNL show.
Yeah, it's that and finding Yvonne Hudson. Those are the two things that that
Yeah.
are on the
There
top
you
of my
go.
bucket list. But let me pitch you something, Bill. May 6th, potentially, Pete Davidson, musical guest Lil Uzi Vert. May 13th, host Michael Cera. Just putting it out there.
Wow. Yeah, that's very. How many people would go? Who? That would make me very sad. He was such a great part of Arrested Development and things like that. So I love that. I love that idea.
Yeah, that could be very fun. So yeah, it was really an impactful time watching television during that strike. And honestly, I never thought it would really happen again, because I was like, I think that I felt that networks would probably be more prepared, but I also could not have been prepared as my younger self to anticipate the changes that would happen in the world of television and movies, where the whole world of entertainment has changed so much now. So it totally makes sense that they would need new contracts and a fair shake from what they were getting then. It's just the world is different in 15 years, and I'm sure it'll be different in another 15 years. My only wish is that the strike date could have ended after the SNL season. But
Yeah, the strike date is always interesting, and there's probably a million things that go into something like that. But it's very intriguing that with all the shows, all network shows are in the can at this point. The season finales have already occurred in some cases, like Abbott Elementary just aired their season finale. So I don't get what impact they get as far as having it start in May. Maybe there wasn't a choice, but yeah, I wish it could have been June 1st.
yeah, definitely. All right, well, now we're in season 48, and I actually sort of feel like the trends we were getting in season 13 and season 33 apply now. It's really crazy where the show is starting to figure it out for the first time in a long time. And the fact that we might get this strike now, when the last two of them were, stopping momentum, is really fascinating. So I think like this is a point in history where if we don't get the Pete Davidson show, people are going to be talking about it for a very long time, about what would have been. And would Pete potentially host in season 49? Because, he's hosting clearly because not only is he a friend of the show, but Bupkis, his show is premiering on Peacock next Thursday, a week from Thursday. So that he won't have that premiere date to promote something. So if the Pete show gets canceled, do you think, Bill, we would see him in 49?
I don't. I think it was completely about the Peacock Show. You make such a great point, and it's one of the first things I wrote down. It's so much like 1988 with the just the momentum that this show has had after a couple of down years, more than a couple of down years. We had COVID, we had the Orange Man, we had kind of getting their footing with 21 cast members the last couple of years. So it's just been such a great resurgence this year, and you could feel it with as we talk about it every week, how exciting it is to be talking about this show and all the great things that we've gotten from people who've been there for a couple of years, and the newcomers, and how much great content they're putting together. The writing has been fantastic. So yeah, it it mirrors 1988 way too much for me. I'm gonna have to go read a book again.
Definitely get on that. So here's the plan. The second we hear that there is a writer's strike or not, we're going to post on social media and let all of our followers know. So if you're not tuning in, you'll get to see this on all the news channels. You may not get all of your news from us, but as far as SNL is concerned, as soon as we know something, you'll know something. So we'll be able to break that all down. If there is no strike or a delayed strike, business as usual here on the podcast. We have a superfan takeover coming up next Monday night. Bill will be a part of that. They'll be talking about the greatest moments in SNL history where a former cast member has come back to host in anticipation for a potential Pete Davidson episode. That'll be the night of May 1st that will air on our YouTube channel. So hopefully we'll know more then and be able to talk about that. So I hope you'll join us in the chat where we'll be able to talk about what we'll see from the season. We'll also do some Bupkis coverage here on the podcast. So that will happen a week from Thursday. We'll be live to recap the premiere of Bupkis. So if you wanted to watch that show, that will be available to you. We'll also probably do recaps of the remaining episodes. So TBD on if that will be, on the main feed or on the patron feed, whatever we end up doing in the future for that, but sort of dependent on if there is a strike or not to fill that content. If there is a strike, just like SNL and NBC and all of the, everyone needs to fill content. We'll find a way here on the podcast filled with interviews, SNL stories, many more shows throughout the summer. So the plan is to still have many live shows here on the podcast. We don't necessarily rely on writers, as you can see with all of the fumbles sometimes we make here on our live shows. So we're still good to go. You have podcasts now. You don't necessarily have to read a book, Bill.
Thank goodness. Oof. Dodged a bullet.
Exactly. All right. Well, I hope you enjoyed this show recapping what is happening in the world with the WGA writer's strike and the history of them with Saturday Night Live. Bill Kenney, thank you for joining me on this journey through SNL history tonight. Where can the listeners reach out to you, and do you have anything to plug?
Thanks always having me, John. You can follow me anywhere at BKLove73. Follow my strike beard on StrikeBeard73. No, just kidding.
Welcome back to the goatee to the podcast. That's a season 46 staple. You can follow us on social media at the SNL Network. Find us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Subscribe to the podcast, especially in these trying times. Subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. It always helps people find the show. You can also find me at John Schneider 24 if you want to chat about Saturday Night Live or anything to do with what is happening in the world of SNL. And I just really look forward to seeing what happens. I want to make a finer point on this before we end the show. We hope that the writers get what they deserve. So that is important to us here, no matter what happens in the future of SNL. All right. For Bill Kenney and everybody in the chat who joined us on this Monday night, my name is John Schneider from the Saturday Night Network. We will see you next time, everybody. Have a good one.